His first sound that day was not a scream, but a silence so loud it felt like a held breath. Imagine walking along a familiar path between fields and an old garden, and seeing something wrapped in black plastic that should not have been there. That is how the story began on the morning of May 10th, 2025, when women in a small village near the riverbank noticed a big black polythene lying by the roadside. Curiosity pulled one of them closer, the same curiosity that makes ordinary people step into danger when they think they might discover something unusual. She opened the bag and a scream cut through the air, raw and sharp, because inside were human limbs. The news raced through the hamlet like fire and dry grass. Within minutes, neighbors gathered, whispers rose, and someone called the police. The discovery felt unreal. A human body had been reduced to parts, wrapped in plastic and scattered, and the village that had known its people for generations suddenly felt like unfamiliar ground. When the inspector and his small team arrived, they did what police do first. They cordoned off the spot, photographed the scene, and collected evidence. The pieces, hands and feet wrapped separately, were cold facts that needed answers. Dressed in the ordinary uniforms of law and routine, the officers were suddenly in the middle of a crime scene that smelled like a story ripped out of a nightmare. For them, the immediate fight was not with hatred or motive, but with time and uncertainty. Identify the body, find the rest of it, and preserve anything that could point to who had done this and why. The police realized quickly this was no accidental death. The way the body was chopped and scattered suggested a deliberate attempt to hide identity and mislead investigators. Underneath the raw horror, professionals did their work methodically. Fingerprints, initial DNA swabs, and witness lists. Because even in small towns, a clear process is often the only way to turn chaos into leads. Word spread beyond the village. Calls went out to nearby police stations, and teams began to search surrounding fields, wells, and riverbanks. In many cases like this, the missing pieces turn up nearby. A well with a smell that locals avoid, a river curve where currents hide evidence, or a deserted patch of scrub that holds the story. The officers followed the same logic. They checked missing persons reports filed in recent days and cross-checked descriptions. A few messages came back. A report had been filed a day earlier for a missing man. But identification would require show-ups and DNA confirmation. While forensic teams prepared to test the limbs, police fanned out to gather the human material of the case. Neighbors' accounts, phone records, and who had been seen coming and going. The village watched the men in uniform move like actors on a stage, and whispers turned into questions that demanded answers. Amid the investigation, an uneasy detail appeared. The villagers remembered a man who had been said to be missing, a retired worker who preferred the quiet of a village life over city noise. He had family both in the village and in the town. He split his time between two simple homes. The neighbors described him as a man past 60, slow and steady, not someone who would vanish without a trace. That fact made people uneasy in a new way. The thought that a familiar presence had vanished and could be dismembered and scattered like refuse. Police took that description and tried to match physical marks. Birthmarks, scars, and physical features that could be visible in the recovered pieces. Meanwhile, the laboratory began the slow clinical job of trying to get a name back from tissue. In rural cases, identification is often the hinge that opens the entire investigation, and everyone in the village suddenly wanted that hinge turned. As the sun set on the first day of the inquiry, investigators were already thinking about the possibility that this was not an act of strangers. The careful removal of parts and the attempt to scatter them seemed planned, not random. That raised the possibility of someone close to the victim being involved. Someone who knew his routine, his vulnerabilities, and where the family's weak points lay. Police officers began to examine family dynamics, habits, and relationships. They checked recent fights, visits from outsiders, and any changes in usual behavior. In small communities, the most extraordinary crimes often emerge from ordinary conflicts, jealousy, money, or secret relationships. The men in uniform knew they needed to pull together the smallest details. Who had argued last? Who had been seen texting? Who had been unusually secretive? To create the portrait of motive. Without a head or a full body to study, motive and opportunity would be the thread they had to follow. Meanwhile, the villagers grappled with fear and gossip. People whispered about the monstrous idea that someone among them might have committed a crime so brutal. They watched for comings and goings late at night, and they compared the man they knew with shadows that suddenly looked suspicious. The missing man's family waited at home for answers, for someone to knock and say it was a mistake. But grief can be patient and sharp. As hours turned into days, the unknown became unbearable. The police urged calm and continued to search wider, including wells and water holes where evidence is often hidden. 2 days after the limbs were found, a strong smell drew attention to an old well about 500 meters from where the plastic had been discovered. That well would change everything in the inquiry, and the discovery there would link the scattered facts into a harder image that even the most protective families could not ignore. When the torso, the midsection of a man, was recovered from the well, the investigation escalated into a homicide case. For a village that had never seen such brutality, the discovery was both confirmation and devastation. The missing man had been killed, and his body had been mutilated. The officers transported the torso for a post-mortem and secured it for detailed forensic tests. In parallel, detectives tried to reach the missing person's complainant to confirm or contradict identities. That phone call would push the case from a field inquiry into something more personal and more complicated. Because the woman who had reported the missing man was connected to the victim by law and home. Her name and the family's reactions drew detectives into a family story that had private motives and public consequences. The family's grief was complicated by suspicion. A missing person report becomes in some cases a strange mirror. It can be an honest cry for help or a deliberate attempt to steer the investigation away from the truth. Detectives had to treat both possibilities as real. They brought relatives in, asked them to identify the remains, and compared DNA with family samples. When the victim's niece and wife were brought to view the torso and the limbs, identity was claimed. The corpse was identified as the retired man the village had known for years. A private home had become a crime scene in the public eye. The police changed the missing person file to a murder case and widened their probe. It was no longer enough to find the person who had committed the crime. They needed to understand why someone so close had been reduced to such a brutal act. As part one closes, the village that once measured time by seasons now measured it by police statements. The first hooks of truth had been found: a body, identification, and the terrible sense that this act had been executed with intent and knowledge. But the shape of motive was still hazy. A rumor here, a tense neighbor there. Investigators had good reason to consider that the culprit might be within the family circle, and that the story behind the death might be a quieter, more poisonous thing than a stranger's rage. The lines between public facts and private betrayals were beginning to blur, and the next days promised revelations that would not only answer who did it, but why they were willing to cross every moral line to do it. The next part will move from discovery to the hidden motives and the plan that turned anger into murder. How does ordinary life become the stage for the extraordinary cruelty of murder? In this village, life looked simple. A retired electrician who liked the peaceful rhythms of the countryside, a wife who preferred the townhouse, and children living at distant places for work and studies on the surface, the family seemed to manage. But beneath the surface, a personal story was unfolding, one that mixed loneliness, desire, and resentment. When investigators dug into the victim's life, they found patterns that small communities often hide: frequent visitors at odd hours, whispered exchanges, and a relationship that would eventually be described as an illicit affair between the wife and a much younger man. Those details gave police a new lens. What began as a search for identity now pointed toward motive, because love and secrecy can quickly produce danger when they collide with family ties and honor jagran. At first, the story of the affair read like countless local sagas. A woman in her 40s met a younger truck driver at a wedding. Numbers exchanged, calls made, late visits arranged. Over a few years, the friendship became more than conversation, and the pair began to meet secretly. Friends and neighbors started to notice a motorcycle arriving when the husband was away. Long conversations that ended when someone passed by the woman's husband, recently retired and accustomed to village life, objected. He argued and sometimes hit her in moments of anger. Instead of ending the relationship, these conflicts seemed to inflame it. The younger man promised escape and solutions, and the woman confessed she felt trapped by circumstances: 4 children, financial pressure, and social expectations. Those facts are not excuses for violence, but they help explain how the desperation in personal lives can build the conditions where extreme choices are made. Once motive appears, opportunity matters. The detectives reconstructed the timeline. The wife called her husband on the morning in question and asked to be picked up before traveling together to the station. A routine task. The husband went to the townhouse to pick her up, unaware that the morning would end in death. The plan, as police later learned, was to drug him, render him unconscious, and then have accomplices finish the rest. The involvement of multiple people suggested coordination: a driver, friends to help move the body, and a place to hide the parts afterward. The officers realized they were looking at a planned execution rather than a murder of passion. That planning made the crime colder and more deliberate, and it meant evidence would exist along a chain: a bought sedative, phone calls between conspirators, and a vehicle used to transport the victim's body. Detectives began to hunt for those links, Text records, witness statements, and neighborhood accounts started to pull the story into focus. The accused lover, a truck driver, had been coming to the village for months. He was not alone. 2 associates were also implicated. The prosecution's picture would later show that the group had lured the husband into drinking a spiked soft drink, waited for him to collapse, and then attacked him with blunt force. After he was dead or beyond help, they used crude tools to separate parts of the body, wrapped them in black polythene, and drove to different spots to scatter them. Such brutality shocks not simply because of the act itself, but because it shows a sequence of decisions made by people who could have chosen otherwise. The police, following phone logs and witness memory, found vehicles that matched accounts and tools that matched wounds. Each small item narrowed the circle of suspicion. The family's insider knowledge became crucial. One of the daughters reported the missing father and testified about her mother's suspicious behavior. Grief, in many cases, is what pushes family members to speak the truth when otherwise they might hide it. The daughter's complaint moved the investigation from local rumor to formal charges. Police reviewed CCTV near town, tracked the presence of the accused truck driver's vehicle, and found inconsistencies in stories the suspects initially told. When the accused were brought in for questioning under pressure, details changed or were omitted. The officers knew the interrogation stage was vital. It was where the small pieces of evidence could be linked to confessions or contradictions. The police presented witnesses, phone records, and travel logs until the stories of the accused began to crumble. At the center of this human web was the woman who had filed the missing person complaint. In a sequence that later read like the worst kind of duplicity, she first reported her husband missing and helped shape the narrative of a man who had simply disappeared. That report bought critical time. Time the conspirators needed to scatter evidence and try to mislead investigators. It is a cruel calculus that sometimes unfolds in domestic crimes. The person closest to a victim can manipulate procedures meant to help find them, and in doing so, delay justice. When police began to cross-check her statements with physical evidence and with the timeline of the body's discovery, contradictions rose to the surface. Under persistent questioning, she eventually confessed and described how the plan had been implemented. Confession changed the investigation from an external search to an examination of motive and moral collapse. Why do normal people commit crimes that break every human boundary? There is never a single answer. In this case, investigators uncovered a blend of motives: an illicit relationship, the promise of a new life, shame, and a desire to be rid of what one conspirator called an obstacle. The younger lover's role included not just physical presence but also a willingness to see the husband removed. Money and escape were the incentives. Secrecy and convenience made violence possible. Communities sometimes fail to see the accumulation of small transgressions before they erupt into catastrophe. The neighbors who saw frequent visits, the husband's temper, the young man's attention, all were ordinary facts that combined into something extraordinary. Detectives emphasized that while motive explains, it never justifies. It helps people understand how ordinary resentments can become extreme acts. As evidence mounted, bought sedatives, the vehicle used to move body parts, and testimonies from the accused, Police arrested the 4 suspects, the wife, the lover, and his 2 associates. One of the accused was wounded in an encounter with police officers during an arrest attempt, and another was captured while fleeing weapons, and the vehicle used in the crime were recovered. The investigation that began with a scream by a polythene-wrapped bag had, in a matter of days, resulted in arrests supported by a chain of physical and testimonial evidence. For the village, this was a dizzying transition from fear and rumor to resolution, and for some, a small measure of closure. But the sense of betrayal, that a wife could conspire to kill her husband, kept the wound open in the community's conscience. Before this part closes, think about the ordinary acts that led there. A wedding where 2 people exchanged numbers, a habit of visiting when a husband was away, a soft drink handed across a table, a promise to take care of a problem. Each small choice compounded into the violent end. The detectives had stitched a timeline out of cigarette butts, messages, and witness memories. The arrests were not the end. They were the start of a judicial process where truth would be argued and evidence scrutinized. In the next part, we will follow that arc. How a legal system and a traumatized community respond, how myths and rumors are tested against facts, and how a family tries to repair what remains after violence has taken everything. The coming section will also answer lingering questions about what the police found, why the head was missing for so long, and what the accused finally admitted in court. The final part begins with the idea that justice is not a single moment, but a slow accumulation of proof and testimony. Once arrested, the 4 accused, the wife, the younger lover, and 2 associates, were presented to the courts. The case was heavy with physical evidence. The dismembered limbs discovered in the field, the torso from the well, CCTV and travel logs showing the movement of a vehicle, and the recovered implements allegedly used in the murder. Investigators had also preserved the phone records that linked conspirators and testimony from family members who filed the complaint. In many legal systems, including the one handling this case, the weight of physical evidence combined with witness accounts can make a compelling file for prosecution. The community watched as ordinary procedure turned into public reckoning. The fate of the missing head became an important subplot because identification and closure often rely on full remains. The accused later told investigators they had thrown the head into the Ghaghra River to hide it. A chilling detail that explains why divers and search teams combed the river with no success. Rivers move. They conceal. They erase. The absence of that final piece meant the family could not perform all customary rites, and it extended the psychological torment. It also left open practical questions on proving identity beyond doubt, though DNA from the other parts and family confirmation were sufficient for the authorities to proceed. The missing head became a symbol of finality that was denied to the grieving family and to the village that sought a clear end to a horrific event. Court hearings moved between formal statements and wrenching testimony. The daughter who filed the complaint sat under cross-examination. The accused gave versions of events that shifted with the pressure of evidence. Under careful interrogation and in the face of forensic facts, the accused admitted to roles in the murder, describing how the husband was lured, drugged, and killed, and then dismembered so the body could be scattered. The confessions, where they existed, were a mix of admission and obfuscation. with some gaps that the prosecution would have to explain to a judge. At this stage, the law's job is not to make people feel better. It is to determine guilt on the available evidence and to ensure due process is observed. For many villagers, that felt slow and unsatisfying, but it is also the mechanism that prevents rash punishments and ensures verdicts hold up on appeal. Beyond the courtroom, the village tried to make sense of the betrayal. Friends and neighbors asked how they could have missed the signs. The answer was partly that people in small towns sometimes protect privacy over suspicion. Partly that relationships are layered and private resentments can be hidden. Local commentators compared this case to other infamous murders where intimate betrayal led to violence. In media and social discussions, the crime became a cautionary tale about secret relationships, the consequences of deception, and how communal bonds can be broken by personal greed or lust. Yet commentators also warned against using the tragedy to create caricatures about women or lovers. Crime cuts across gender, age, and class, and motives are rarely simple. There are practical lessons embedded in the raw facts. First, the police work was decisive. Quick evidence collection, cross-checking missing person reports, and connecting physical evidence to phone data and vehicle movements led to arrests. Second, family members' willingness to speak up, especially when the daughter filed the complaint, changed the trajectory of the case. Had the family not reported things as they did, the perpetrators might have escaped farther. Third, the case shows how modern forensic tools, DNA, CCTV, and digital records transform investigations that once relied only on circumstantial evidence. These advantages also have an ethical cost. They can expose painful private matters and leave families vulnerable to public scrutiny as the law does its work. Many myths and half-truths circulate after crimes like this. People often assume that affairs always lead to violence, or that all domestic disputes must end in tragedy. That is not so. Most relationships that falter do not become crimes. Another myth is that brutal crimes are always the result of social breakdown or a failing justice system. In truth, almost every case has its own messy sequence of personal decisions. Finally, some people imagine that once a head is lost, identity is impossible to prove. Modern forensic methods, however, can identify individuals through DNA from other parts, dental records, and corroborative evidence. In this case, even without the head, the combination of DNA, family identification, and confessions provided the court with the material needed to press charges. These are painful truths but important corrections to reactionary gossip. In the wake of this horror, the community faced the longer work of repair healing. After violent betrayal requires more than punishment. It requires conversations about secrecy, the stigma that drives people to hide relationships, and community support for families left in ruins. Local leaders called for greater vigilance and for helping families in conflict find nonviolent solutions. The daughter and children have to rebuild lives shadowed by public disgrace and personal loss. The law can remove perpetrators from the street, but it cannot restore the ordinary trust that once existed among neighbors. This case will linger in the memory of the village as both a tragic failure of private ethics and a demonstration of how a community and its institutions respond to extreme crime. Finally, what does this case ask of us? The viewers, the neighbors, the citizens who read about it from a distance? It asks for empathy toward victims, clarity about evidence before passing judgment, and a commitment to supporting social systems that help families in distress. It asks us to resist the simple stories that gossip prefers and to listen instead to the facts that investigators have established. Yet it also asks a question I want to leave with you, a question that will keep the comment section alive and honest. When ordinary human needs for love, respect, and dignity collide with desperate choices, how should a community balance punishment with prevention? And where should society invest to stop private betrayals from becoming public horrors? What do you think would have prevented this tragedy, and what should be done now to protect vulnerable families around us?